old, decaying mental hospital known for its troubled past, a nurse named Emily worked the night shift. She often heard strange noises from a long, dimly lit hallway that no one seemed to visit. At first, she thought it was just the wind or the building settling, but the noises grew more distinct. Whispers, footsteps, and the faint sound of someone crying out. When Emily decided to investigate, she found a door at the end of the hallway that led to a forgotten part of the hospital. The lights flickered as she approached, and she could swear she felt cold breath against her neck. The door creaked open, revealing an empty, abandoned room. But as she turned to leave, she saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, a man with hollow eyes staring at her. When she ran back to the nurse's station, she found out that the man had been a patient who had died years ago, but his whispers never stopped. Sarah had been working at the psychiatric ward for months and was used to the oddities of her patients. But there was one who stood out, a schizophrenic man named John. He was obsessed with his reflection. He would stand in front of the bathroom mirror for hours, speaking to someone only he could see. One night, Sarah was called to check on him after reports of strange sounds coming from his room. As she approached, she saw him staring into the mirror with an expression of pure terror. His face contorted in fear, and he whispered to the reflection, "It's him. He's back." Sarah asked who he was talking about, but John only pointed at the mirror, his eyes wide with panic. When Sarah stepped closer, she noticed something horrifying. His reflection moved independently of him. The figure in the mirror smiled at her, a twisted, mocking grin. Before Sarah could react, the glass cracked and the reflection disappeared, leaving only an empty, dark room. The next day, John was found dead, his eyes wide open, staring at the mirror. In the solitary confinement wing of an old psychiatric hospital, a patient named Richard was locked away for violent outbursts. He was known to speak of dark, shadowy figures that followed him and whispered in his ear. The staff dismissed his claims as delusions, but things started to escalate. One night, a guard reported seeing a dark shadow darting across the hallway outside Richard's cell. When he opened the door to check on Richard, he found him sitting in the corner, eyes wide, muttering, "They're coming." The next day, the cell was found empty. Richard had vanished without a trace, but his cell was covered in claw marks as if something had tried to break in. Staff later reported that the shadow was seen again, lingering in the hallways, as if it was waiting for someone else. Room 313 had a reputation. No one dared stay in it for long, and those who did often ended up as a shadow of their former selves. Nurses and staff whispered about the strange happenings that occurred within its walls. Patients who stayed in the room would cry out in the middle of the night, claiming to see grotesque, inhuman faces staring at them from the walls. One nurse, newly assigned to the room, was skeptical of the rumors and decided to stay in the room herself one night. But as the hours passed, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew thick, and a strange, cold mist seemed to form in the corners of the room. Then she heard it, a low, guttural voice whispering her name. Terrified, she turned to the corner of the room, only to see an indistinct figure standing there, its face obscured by darkness. As she stepped closer, the figure reached out with long, skeletal hands and gripped her arm. She screamed, but no one came. The next day, the room was empty, and the nurse was found in a catatonic state, mumbling about the eyes in the walls. When Thomas, a longtime patient suffering from a severe mental breakdown, was bedridden in his final days, he began speaking of horrific visions. He told the nurses he saw shadowy figures standing around his bed, waiting for his soul to leave his body. The figures whispered to him in a language no one could understand. Despite the nurses' attempts to calm him, his condition worsened, and he passed away one night, still speaking about the ones who come for you after death. The next morning, the nurses discovered his bed was soaked in cold sweat, and strange footprints marked the floor, leading from the bed to the door. But when they opened the door, they found nothing but an empty hallway. Days later, the hospital staff began hearing whispers at night, and some claimed to see Thomas's shadow wandering the halls, seeking someone to join him in the afterlife.